My son is 16 years old, and one afternoon he looked at me across the dinner table and said something that I haven't been able to unhear since. He didn't say it to hurt me. He said it the way teenagers say things that are true, quietly. Without drama, the way you point out that it's raining outside. Like he'd been sitting on this observation for long, enough that it had stopped feeling like a problem and started feeling like furniture, he said. "Dad, you always agree with her." I remember the exact weight of the fork in my hand. The smell of whatever Carol had made for dinner. The sound of the television in the other room, everything ordinary and unchanged, around me while something in my chest just went completely still. Because he was right. And I knew he was right. And I had known for a long time. Somewhere underneath all the daily noise of being a husband and a father and a functioning adult in a house that ran on schedule I had known, I just hadn't let myself say it. Not to Carol, not to my friends, not to myself. Especially not to myself. That's what I never said. Not out loud, not for 5 years. Not until my own son handed it to me across a plate of pasta on a Thursday evening. My name is Dave. I'm 52 years old. I spent 23 years as a civil engineer. And I'm going to tell you about the 5 years I spent slowly disappearing inside my own marriage, how it happened.
Oh, that's why.
I let it happen. And what it finally cost me before I decided I wasn't willing to pay that price anymore. But I have to warn you, the part that scared me most wasn't what I had lost. It was what I watched my son starting to lose right in front of me because he was learning from me. I hadn't realized it until it was almost too late. Carol and I met when we were both 26. She was building a graphic design consultancy from nothing. Cold calls, late nights, freelance clients who paid slow and complained fast, and watching her do that with the kind of focused, relentless energy she had, I thought, that is the person I want to build a life with. We got married at 29. Jake came 4 years later. And for a long time, we were good. Not magazine cover good, but real good. The kind where you argue about real things and laugh at private jokes and know each other's difficult edges and stay anyway. I was managing large infrastructure projects, the kind where you're coordinating 40-man crews across multi-site operations, where a miscalculation doesn't just cost money, it costs lives. I was good at it. I was the kind of man who built bridges, and I want you to remember that detail, because it matters later. When Jake was 11, Carol got the diagnosis. Severe depression. Not the word people use casually when they've had a rough week, the clinical, debilitating kind that makes ordinary tasks feel like moving through concrete. That makes the woman who used to cold call strangers unable to answer the phone. Her consultancy started falling apart. Her clients were leaving. And watching the depression try to take the business on top of everything else was accelerating everything in the worst possible direction. So I stepped in. That's what I was raised to do. You see a structural failure and you shore it up. You redistribute the load. You keep the whole thing from collapsing. I renegotiated my contracts to work fewer site hours. I took over the house, groceries, cooking, Jake's, school pickups, the bills, the calendar, and the quiet maintenance of Carol's business until she was strong enough to step back into it, and told myself this is temporary. This is what love looks like when it gets tested. 6 months, maybe a year, and then we recalibrate. We go back to normal. I want to be honest with you. I believe that. I don't tell this story to paint Carol as the villain because she isn't. She was sick. She fought hard to get better. What happened between us wasn't a crime. It was something quieter and in some ways more insidious than any crime. Because at least with a crime, you know someone did something wrong. What happened to me didn't have a villain. It had a process. It was erosion. And erosion doesn't announce itself. That's the whole problem. Here's how a man loses himself. Inside a long marriage without anyone planning it, you give a little here. You defer a little there. You stop weighing in on the vacation because Carol already found the rental and it looks fine, and there's no good reason to make it a negotiation. You stop arguing about which school Jake should transfer to because Carol researched it more thoroughly than you did, and her logic is sound. You stop having opinions about Sunday dinner because what does it matter? and you've got a conference call Monday morning, and the energy you'd spend on caring about. Dinner's energy you don't have. And every single time you do this, you tell yourself it's generosity. It's patience. It's a man not sweating the small stuff. It's love in the practical, unsexy daily version that doesn't look like anything from the outside. Carol got better. Genuinely, remarkably better. 18 months of therapy, the right medication adjusted 3 times before they found the combination that worked. A lot of hard private work that I watched her do, and that I still have enormous respect for. She came back. The woman who used to cold call strangers came back, but the house hadn't been waiting for her. While she was recovering, I had filled every available space. I had become the one who organized things, scheduled things, managed things, not because she couldn't, but because I was already doing it, and stopping felt like abandonment. And when she recovered and stepped back in, we didn't renegotiate. We didn't sit down and ask how we wanted to divide the weight now that she could carry her half again. We just continued. She kept deciding. I kept executing. And because neither of us named it, neither of us changed it, my buddy Ken, we've known each other since grad school. He was the best man at my wedding, took me to lunch about 2 years into this, and said something. I deflected at the time and thought about for 2 years afterward. He said, "Dave, you managed 40 men building a bridge overpass. You are not a man who can't make decisions. What happened to you?" And I laughed and said, "Carol was just better at the household logistics." And Ken looked at me the way a man looks at his friend when he knows the friend is lying and doesn't want to push. But here's what I didn't tell Ken. Because I hadn't let myself fully see it yet, it wasn't just the household decisions I had stopped making. It was the work decisions. Which projects to take, which to pass on. I had started running those by Carol too. Not because she had expertise in civil engineering, but because I had lost the muscle of trusting my own judgment. 5 years of deferring had made it feel dangerous to decide anything unilaterally. My self-confidence hadn't disappeared dramatically. It had just quietly atrophied. It's the way a muscle does when you stop using it. I was a man who had sacrificed his career flexibility and his professional identity for his family. And I had told that story so many times, framed it as strength so many times, that I had completely missed the part where strength had quietly become something else. And that is where the thing that frightened me most started to happen. Because I was so focused on what I had been losing that I almost missed what Jake was. Watching about 8 months before that dinner table conversation, I started noticing something. Jake, who had always been opinionated, argumentative in the way smart teenagers are argumentative, the kid who used to debate me about everything from sports statistics to whether a hot dog was a sandwich, Jake had gotten quieter, not sullen quiet. Not withdrawn in a concerning way. Just agreeable. When Carol suggested something, he went along with it. When I suggested something, he waited to see what Carol said before he committed to a response. He stopped pushing back at the dinner table. He stopped having the debates. I told myself it was just growing up. Teenagers go internal. It's normal. But the thing about spending 23 years calculating structural load is that you develop a sensitivity to things bearing weight they shouldn't be bearing. Things bending in directions that don't match the stress they're under. And something in my brain kept flagging Jake. Kept saying that angle isn't right. That isn't how that's supposed to bend. I just wasn't ready to do the math yet. Because the math led somewhere I didn't want to go. When I finally admitted to myself that I had become an invisible husband inside my own marriage, a man who had handed over his decision-making, his professional presence, his voice, piece by piece, and called it love while he did it, I did what any engineer does when he identifies a structural problem. I made a plan. I was going to reassert myself, systematically. I actually wrote a list, which in retrospect is one of the more tragicomac things I've ever done. A list of domains where I was going to start making independent decisions again. Work projects, weekend plans, car maintenance, Jake's extracurricular schedule. I was going to approach the reclamation of my own personality the way I'd approach retrofitting a compromised foundation, methodically. With clear milestones, the first item on the list was the college campus tour. I found a university open day, 2 hours away, relevant to Jake's interests, something I had researched and organized entirely on my own. I was going to announce it at dinner, not ask. Announce, and it was going to be the first data point in my systematic recovery of myself. I said it at dinner. I've organized a campus visit for Jake. Saturday. We're going. And Carol looked up and said, very calmly, I already scheduled his SAT prep tutoring for Saturday. Dave, I told you last week. She had. I had no memory of it. And I said, okay. And my systematic recovery of myself lasted approximately 11 minutes. The problem wasn't Carol blocking me. The problem was that I had spent 5 years training myself out of the habit of existing as a full person inside this marriage. And you cannot undo 5 years of conditioning with a Saturday announcement and a legal pad? Learned passivity doesn't announce itself as passivity. It announces itself as reasonableness, as flexibility, as being a man who doesn't need to make everything about himself. And by the time you recognize it for what it is, it's been living in your body long enough to feel like your natural resting state. I stood at the kitchen sink that night, rinsing plates while Carol helped Jake with his homework in the next room. And I thought, I have built bridges. I have managed complex multi-million-dollar projects under deadline. I have calculated loads and failure, points for structures that carry thousands of people every single day, and I cannot figure out how to exist inside my own house as a complete person. And that's the moment I finally said the thing I'd been circling for 5 years to myself, quietly over a sink full of dishes. I didn't lose myself because Carol took anything from me. I lost myself because I put myself down so many times in so many small moments that I stopped being able to find where I'd left me. And what I never said, not to Carol, not to Jake, not to anyone, was that I genuinely did not know who I was any more outside of being useful to this family. If that's landing somewhere in you right now, stay with me. Hit subscribe. I'm not done, and the part that comes next is the part that actually broke everything open. Part 5. The understanding. 12:30 to 16 o'clock. I called Ken on a Sunday morning, not to talk about Carol, not to talk about the marriage. I called because I needed to talk about Jake. I described what I'd been watching. The quietness, the agreeableness. The way he'd stopped pushing back at the table. The way he waited to calibrate his response to whatever Carol said before he committed to an opinion of his own. And Ken was quiet for a long time, and then he said, Dave, who does that sound like? I didn't answer because I didn't have to. My son was 16 years old, and he was already learning how to disappear. That's the thing nobody tells you about. A man who loses himself inside a long marriage, he doesn't disappear quietly into a vacuum. He disappears in front of his children, and children are not passive observers. They are apprentices. They are watching every single day for the answer to the question, what does it look like to be a man? What does a man do when things get hard? How does a man exist inside a family when things are difficult? And I had been answering that question every day for 5 years with my silence. With my compliance, with my careful, invisible self-erasure. And Jake had been taking notes. I thought about my own father, a man who worked hard and loved his family, and never once in my memory expressed a preference that contradicted my mother's. I grew up thinking that was humility. I grew up thinking that was what a good man looked like. Steady, uncomplaining, frictionless. It took me until I was 52 years old, standing in a kitchen with a legal pad full of reclamation milestones that lasted 11 minutes, to understand that what I had learned from my father wasn't humility, it was disappearance with a different label. And I had handed it to Jake without ever saying a single word. Here is what nobody tells you about being the invisible husband. About being the man who sacrificed his career flexibility and his professional identity and his voice. For his family, the sacrifice doesn't stop with you. It replicates. It teaches. It becomes the water your children swim in, and they call it normal because they've never seen anything else. And one day they will be 40 or 50 and standing in their own kitchens wondering why they can't locate themselves anymore. And they will not be able to trace it back to any single moment because it never was a single moment. I sat with that for a long time. Long enough that Carol noticed something had shifted. She asked me twice in 1 week if I was okay. I said yes both times, and the second time she looked at me in a way I recognized, It was the look of a woman who has been living with a man who agrees with everything for so long that she can no longer tell when he actually means it. And that is when I understood something I had been completely wrong about for 5 years. The marriage Carol and I had built in the wake of her illness. The one where she decided and I executed, and neither of us named what that arrangement was costing us. That marriage wasn't easier for her than it was for me. It was lonelier. She had been living with a support function that wore my face. She had been making decisions for 2 people for 5 years, not because she wanted to control everything, but because I had quietly left her alone at the table, and eventually a person stops, setting a place for someone who never shows up. I had been telling myself a story about sacrifice. And the story was true as far as it went. I did sacrifice things, real things, for my family. But the story I hadn't been telling was the one where the sacrifice had become an identity, where checking out had become a habit I dressed up as devotion, where the man who built bridges had stopped showing up for the smaller structures that actually hold a life together. That was the moment the real conversation became possible. Not because I had fixed anything, but because I had finally stopped mislabeling what was broken. I chose a Sunday evening. The house was quiet. Jake was in his room, and I sat down next to Carol on the couch and said something I had absolutely no prepared script for. I said, "In all of it, in taking care of you when you were sick, in trying to hold everything together, somewhere in there I put myself down, and I kept expecting to pick myself back up, but I never did. And I'm not saying that to blame you, because you didn't take anything from me. I handed it over, piece by piece, and I told myself it was love. But I think what I actually did was check out of this marriage while staying in the house. And I think you've been alone in here with me for years, and I think Jake is learning from it. And I can't keep letting him learn this." It was not eloquent. I said I think 4 times. There was a pause long enough that I genuinely considered asking if she wanted more water, to have something to do with my hands. And then Carol said, "I know. I've been waiting for you to say something for 2 years." She said she missed the version of me that pushed back, that argued. That brought a perspective she actually had to reckon with. That the man who agreed with everything was not easier to live with. He was more isolating to live with, because you cannot really connect with someone who has no edges. And she had spent 2 years wondering whether I was okay or whether I had just stopped caring. And she hadn't known how to ask without making it worse. We talked for 2 hours. Not everything got resolved. Some of what we said we needed to sit with for several days. But for the first time in 5 years, it was a real conversation between 2 real people, not a briefing between a manager and an assistant. Not a functional exchange between a woman who decides and a man who executes. Something with actual friction and actual honesty and actual risk. The way real conversations between real people are supposed to feel. The next morning, I knocked on Jake's door. I sat on the edge of his bed, and I told him he was right. That I had been going along with things for a long time and calling it keeping the peace. And that keeping the peace is not the same as being present, and a man who never has a disagreement inside, his own home probably hasn't actually showed up for. I told him I had watched my own father do the same thing, and that I had mistaken it for strength for 30 years, and that I was 52 years old before. I understood the difference between a man who is genuinely at peace and a man who has just stopped speaking. I told him I wasn't going to be perfect at changing it, but I was going to try to show him something different. He nodded the way 60-year-olds nod when a conversation has gone longer than expected but landed somewhere real. And then he said, "You want to go throw a ball around?" We threw a ball around for 40 minutes. We barely talked. And somewhere in those 40 minutes of ordinary silence between a father and his son, something that had been slowly bending in the wrong direction started moving back toward where it was supposed to be. I'm not going to tell you my marriage is fixed, because it isn't, not in the way people mean when they use that word. What I can tell you is that Carol and I are having real conversations again. The kind where both people bring something and both people leave changed. And that after 5 years of managed distance, we are finding our way back to something genuine. And I can tell you that Jake has started arguing with me again. Small things. Dumb things. Whether a particular quarterback deserves his contract. Whether the restaurant we picked for his birthday was actually better than the other place. Stupid arguments about nothing. They are the best arguments I have ever had. A man who lost himself inside a long marriage, who spent years as an invisible husband, who disappeared so gradually inside his own family that he stopped being able to find the edges of himself. That man doesn't heal in a single conversation, but he starts to heal the moment he stops calling the disappearance something it isn't. I called it love for 5 years. It wasn't love. Love doesn't require you to stop existing. Love doesn't ask you to erase yourself so completely that your son looks at you across the dinner table and recognizes the pattern he's afraid of becoming. What I never said, not to Carol, not to Jake, not to myself, was simply, I'm still here. I still have something worth saying. I still take up space in this family, and I am not leaving. Not really, not into silence. On this channel, a man says what he never said out loud, and if something in you needed to hear this, there's always another story waiting. Think about the last time you agreed with something just to make it go away. Think about who was watching when you did. And if you decide to stop, come back and tell me what happened.